Last time we reminded ourselves of some important background to the part of God's narrative we're about to hear. Remember how Lucifer, lifted up with unbelievable arrogance, led a rebellion of many angels against God, and how they were expelled from God's presence to await their terrible eventual fate. But far from being remorseful or repentant, to this day they remain committed in their hatred, their antipathy toward God and his image-bearing human race, us. So we return to the narrative where we left off. Adam and Eve in their true, pure innocence, relishing the place God had made for them, delighting in their companionship, growing, we can safely assume, under God's tutelage, in their grasp of what's involved in their caretaking responsibilities over creation, and enjoying their relationship with God as their guide and father. Remember the freedom they were given to enjoy the produce from the garden. We can only imagine the sights and sounds and tastes that were available to them, the variety of decorative and edible plants, the animals around them, and their senses perfectly tuned to appreciate everything they were experiencing. One observer of all of this found no delight in the life of these humans in paradise or their relationship with God. We can only begin to imagine the bitterness, the hatred that must have consumed Satan as he watched these image bearers of the one whose position he coveted, and the jealousy over their God-given caretaker roles in creation. Watching and waiting, he hatches a plan to try to bring about the death, the separation that God had said would result from the humans going their own way and eating of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. In Genesis chapter 3, God's narrative describes the day when he enacts his plan. We aren't told specifically why Satan chooses to disguise himself as a snake, although the text gives us a hint by saying that it was the shrewdest, the most clever of the animals, as in Genesis chapter 3, verse 1. A pattern is established here that continues to the present time of God's enemy carefully, cunningly, viciously finding ways to disguise himself and wrapping his deception in attractive or seemingly benign packaging. And, as we'll see, finding our points of vulnerability, using our pride, our desires for fulfillment, whatever he can to whisper his false story to us. His intent is not to frighten, but to deceive. And he and his servant, fallen angels, are masters of their craft. Certainly from the narrative in Genesis 3:1, when he finds Eve alone, she's not alarmed and very willing to conduct a conversation. It's significant that he begins with questions. Questions often seem neutral, but it's always important to assess the premise from which they come. His line of questioning will effectively cause her to doubt God's good motives towards them, and by implication to create for the first time a glimpse of another more independent and self-determining approach to life. Why should they, after all, is the implication, not make decisions for themselves? Surely God's warning about death resulting from eating fruit from a particular tree is exaggerated. What was all this about death anyway? Could it be that God had selfishly kept something agreeable back from them? Were his intentions towards them so perfect after all? Had they been naive in believing and obeying him so unquestioningly up to this point? Might there be an unexplored and desirable dimension to life less dependent on him? And so, gladly buying into Satan's deception, being enticed now by the appearance of the tree, and suddenly hungry for the independent wisdom he said would result, she eats some of the fruit. This is in Genesis chapter 3, verse 6. The woman was convinced. She saw that the tree was beautiful and its fruit looked delicious, and she wanted the wisdom it would give her. So she took some of the fruit and ate it. Then she gave some to her husband who was with her, and he ate it too. And then, as we know, as it says, Adam ate some as well as the woman. The results of their decision were immediate and catastrophic. The narrative says nothing about any physical changes to them or their surroundings, but everything had changed. They saw everything differently. Indeed, it says in Genesis chapter 3, verse 7, that their eyes were opened, but it was not the pleasant, liberating experience Satan had intimated and which they'd imagined. They suddenly found themselves ashamed, naked, exposed, no longer at home in the world that God had created for them, no longer comfortable with who they were or with each other. So had God exaggerated when he said they'd die if they ate from the tree? They were still breathing, their senses were still functioning, but God had, of course, spoken truly. Death, inevitably and tragically, had now become part of who they were. They had chosen to cut themselves off from God, the source of their life. Physical death had now become the end point of their lives on the earth, their trajectory. And ultimately, they were destined eternally for the place prepared for the enemy, all the enemies of God. That's who they'd identified with, and they would share his fate, their fate. The narrative makes it clear that the amazing God to God image bearer relationship was now broken. And that's the real essence of death. Where formerly they were innocently pure, now their nakedness brought a sense of shame, of dissonance in God's world. And now they are forced by their own choice to seek their own solutions, to provide their own needs. Feeling shame and wrongly assuming this is an external problem, a matter of form, they try to hide their shame with leaves, to make themselves presentable again according to their own standards, according to their own perceptions of good and evil. But that's no solution at all. Their problem is inner, of the spirit. It's way out of their control, their ability to patch things up. Now, when God comes to the garden, which it sounds from the narrative like he does regularly up to this time, they hide. Fear has displaced harmony and delight. Everything is wrong. Everything is out of kilter. Shame and fear were in fact the right response for them. They had much to be ashamed of and much to fear. They had listened to God's enemy and identified with his rebellion. They had become rebels and enemies themselves in their very being, and this too is death. They were now facing the righteous anger of a God who will not, who cannot ignore anyone who arrogantly tries to tell their own story. It's his. He's the author. Anyone who doesn't acknowledge that, who listens to any other voice, will suffer the eternal consequences.